Finished getting our coffee and breakfast, and let's take a seat. We're getting ready to start. I think we're just about at the top of the hour. Double check. Actually, we have 1 minute. Let me do mine first. Okay. Greetings, everyone. Now, it's a beautiful day. We got to get a little bit more excited than this. Greetings, everyone.
Greetings.
Welcome to the quarterly Justice Roundtable Assembly. For those who don't know, I'm Nikichi Taifa. I'm convener at the Justice Roundtable and advocacy director for criminal justice for the Open Society Foundations and the Open Society Policy Center. For those who don't know, the Roundtable is a coalition of over 100 organizations working in Washington on federal criminal justice policy reform. We've been around since 2002. This is really our 15th year, folks. Can you believe it? Working groups of the Roundtable, specifically, I'll say first, the reentry working group was largely responsible and the catalyst behind what ultimately became known as the Second Chance Reentry Bill, which passed in 2008. For those who remember our early days when we were around in the other building, a lot of the specifics of that legislation was brainstormed and drafted around the table just like this by some of us who are in the room. And in 2010, our sentencing reform working group was part of the catalyst behind what became known as the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010, which reduced the disparity between crack and powder cocaine. And just recently, during the last term of the Obama administration, our Commutations and Pardons working group worked very closely with respect to the Obama-era clemency initiative, which resulted in the release from unjust incarceration of over 1,700 people. So the Roundtable has been on a roll, and we're going to continue to be on the roll precisely because of people who are around the table just like you. So we're going to find out who's around the table right now. I will say that we normally have more people on the phone than around the table. Folk are on the phone this morning as well, but today, different from other roundtable assemblies, the phones will be muted the whole time. So unfortunately, we're going to not be able to hear just who you are on the phone. And then there are countless others across the country, and might I say, should I, Jocelyn, across the world, who might be viewing this roundtable on LiveStream. I was trying to, you all know anything about my Facebook. I like to call myself the master of the Facebook Live. I wanted to do something similar to that with the roundtable, but not similar, something professional. And I think I got a little bit more professional than I thought. We have a whole production going on here, but it's all good. We're just going to be rolling the way we normally roll every single quarter. So again, we're going to start on my right, and we'll end with our featured speaker for this morning. Again, Nikichi Taifa, just give your name and your organization, Open Society Policy Center.
Jesselyn McCurdy, American Civil Liberties Union.
Michael Collins, Drug Policy Alliance.
Jenny Collier, representing Innocence Project.
Mark Osler, University of St. Thomas in Minnesota.
Charlie Sullivan, CURE.
Samuel Kaplan, CURE DC chapter.
Amanda Musa, NACDO. Jasmine Heiss, Coalition for Public Safety.
Madhu Garwal, Constitution Project.
Kara Dansky, 1,000 Arms.
Jody Kent-Levy, Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth.
Marcy Mestrat, the Campaign for Youth Justice.
Eric Lotke, National Education Association.
I just have to say that Nikichi's been the most magnificent, brilliant intelligent, inspiring, and amazing leader in the 10 years I've been in Washington. And I am humbled, blessed, and thankful and honored to be with you all these years. And I'm Howard Wooldridge from LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition.
I'm Anthony Thomas Davis with the Brennan Center for Justice.
Reggie Babin with Senator Schumer.
John Stannard with the Church of Scientology's National Affairs Office here in D.C.
Hi, Mel Wilson, National Association of Social Workers.
Hayne Yoon from the Vera Institute. Good morning, Nicole Porter with the Sentencing Project.
Kara Gotch with the Sentencing Project.
Tanya Bennett with the American Civil Liberties Union.
For our production thing, everyone has to use this.
Kevin Vogel-Gemfey with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights.
Tess Varden with the Lawyers Committee.
Ariel Gingold with Bend the Arc Jewish Action.
Joanne Braxton, Braxton Institute.
Eric Bussey, Braxton Institute.
Philippa Iyer, Vera Institute.
Darius Crow, Vera Institute.
Libby Love, Vera Institute.
Mordecai, Robert F. Kennedy, Human Rights.
Good morning, Keisha Robinson with the D.C. Public Defender Services Prisoner and Reentry Legal Services Program.
Good morning, Charles Stone, D.C. Office on Human Rights.
Good morning, Jasmine Mickens, Open Society Policy Center.
Athiba Bashan, Constitution Project.
Kate Holden, Coalition for Public Safety.
Regina Powers, MALDEF.
Justin Iwanzak, American Civil Liberties Union.
Michael Santos, National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty.
Petra McGinty, Center for Community Change.
Jamie Worker, Center for Community Change.
Megan Buchanan, Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth.
Callie Tambray and the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth.
Brittany Campbell, Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth.
Carrie Lee, Campaign for Fair Sentencing of Youth.
Beth Curtis, Life for Pot.
Christina Gilbert, National Juvenile Defender Center.
Carmen Crusoe, Open Society Foundations.
Good morning, Che Nimhard from the Executive Alliance for Boys and Men of Color.
Riley Tillett, Drug Policy Alliance.
Queen Adesui, Drug Policy Alliance.
Alyssa Stryker, Drug Policy Alliance.
Karma El Musa, Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth.
Nicola Nebeljuris, Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth.
Jeff Pudlow, here on my own behalf.
Abigail Stahl, Open Society Foundations.
Damon Hewitt, Executives Alliance for Boys and Men of Color.
Monica Reed, NACDL.
Ian Jessensen, NACDL.
Leslie Pollock with the Leadership Conference.
Jonathan Marcello with the Leadership Conference.
Pamela Kennebrew, Black Women's Center for Carceral Empowerment, Philadelphia.
Zoe Root, Justice Programs Office at American University.
Genevieve Citron Ray, Justice Programs Office at American University.
Hi, Eric Lynch, Brennan Center.
Deanna Matthew, Council for Court Excellence.
Erin O'Neill, Council for Court Excellence.
Rachel Rudo Jalvo, Council for Court Excellence.
Aisha Pearson, Counselor for Court Excellence.
Christian Fisher, Counsel for Court Excellence.
Good morning, Jamie Argento Rodriguez with the Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia's Community Defender Division.
Jillian Kiley, Healing Justice Project.
Mallory Cook, Healing Justice Project.
Samuel Olivant, Legal Intern at National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty.
Hannah Mitchell, National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty.
Okay, great, thank you. So the way we're going to proceed, and we'll just wait, just for a moment. Our Justice Roundtable assemblies, which are quarterly, we have our introductions, and then we have brief video. It's totally not more than 5 minutes on a relevant theme. We have our featured guests, who I will be introducing in a moment, and then we go into our working group discussions and our updates. Everything that's said here at the Roundtable Assembly is off the record, but we know that since this is a huge production, don't say anything that you wouldn't expect to see on the front page of the Washington Post. The nitty-gritty of the Roundtable is its working groups, and that's where strategy is discussed, brainstorming is done, and we can really get down in the weeds. But the Roundtable is more general, public gatherings for those who aren't necessarily enmeshed in the day-to-day work of the working groups, can still get a feel for what is happening and what is going on. We're going to show 2 very short videos. Together, they don't total more than 5 minutes. The first one is really more relevant to our law enforcement reform working group. It features over 25 celebrities from Beyonce, Alicia Keys, Bono, Taraji Henson, Janelle Monáe, Common, Chris Rock, and many more, discussing 23 ways that you can die being Black in America. And this came out last year. It ends up with a plea to the last administration, but still very relevant today as well. And the second video is really something that I found quite, I don't know the word for it, but I remember back in the day, some of you all weren't born then, but there was this ad that came out that was talking about, this is your brain, and then this is your brain on drugs, and there was a frying pan and an egg, and it was smashed, and it was just one of the most horrific pieces of propaganda that is out there. Well, last year, the Drug Policy Alliance resurrected, I guess you could say, and recalibrated that PSA by the same person who did it, with a very clear message now. And all I can say is just watch it. I just thought it was very cute and amusing. And then we're going to get into our feature presentation. So let's let the videos roll. And I don't know if we are going to dim the lights or maybe not. Those who know will do whatever's appropriate.
This is one of the millions of Americans who uses drugs and won't get arrested. However, this American is several times more likely to be charged with a drug crime. Imagine it's you. This is the day you get caught. This is your day in court. This is your sentencing. This is your cell. This is your first day on the outside. This is your fresh start. Was your fresh start. Here are your job prospects. This is your shot at a college degree. Or not. This is your family. This is your debt collector. These are the dreams you have for your children. This is someone else's family. Someone else's life. Someone who used drugs but was never caught. This is how you feel! The war on drugs is ruining people's lives. It fuels mass incarceration. It targets people of color in greater numbers than their white counterparts. It cripples communities. It costs billions, and it doesn't work. Any questions?
Failing to signal a lane change. Riding in your girlfriend's car with a child in the back.
Running to the bathroom in your own apartment.
Selling cigarettes outside of a corner store.
Riding a commuter train.
Walking home with a friend. selling CDs outside of a supermarket.
Wearing a hoodie.
Walking away from police.
Walking toward police. Missing a front license plate.
Holding a fake gun in the park in Ohio.
Driving with a broken brake light.
Sitting in your car before your bachelor party.
Walking up the stairwell of your apartment building.
Calling for help after an accident.
Holding a fake gun in Virginia.
On the way to Bible study.
Holding a fake gun in Walmart.
Laughing.
Holding a wallet.
For attending a birthday party.
Doing absolutely nothing.
Not servile enough. Go to weareheremovement.com to tell President Obama and Congress that the time for change is now. We demand radical transformation to heal a long history of systemic racism so that all Americans have the equal right to live and to pursue happiness.
Lights back on. Thank you. So it really gives me great honor. I'm really thrilled to be sitting right next to someone who really is an icon. Well, you're an icon. Your daddy was an icon, and I didn't know him. Civil rights leader extraordinaire James Foreman and his son James Foreman Jr., who is right here today. You know, I knew James when he was with the Public Defender Service. You didn't know I knew you, but I knew you because I kind of been following you. I knew when you started, helped to start the Maya Angelou public charter school, and, you know, just all the great and fabulous things. So when I found out that you were doing a book about what was going on in my hometown, I'm a D.C. girl, a native Washingtonian, I was very interested and I was very excited. And when you first started talking, I must admit, I'm being very honest, I was a little bit concerned. I was like, how is he going to address this? And, you know, I'm not quite sure, you know, about the premise and all like that. But I'm telling you, when the book came out and I read it, Locking Up Our Own Crime and Punishment in Black America by James Foreman Jr., it was a book that I could not put down. It was very, very relevant. It was excellently written. We're talking about a book that was on the Washington Post bestseller and the New York Times best choice, seller's choice, editor's choice. I just want to share something that Van Jones wrote on the back of the book. James Foreman masterfully explores why so many African Americans supported tough criminal laws over the past 50 years and why more recently their attitudes began to shift. Combining dramatic stories from his work as a public defender with original historical research, Foreman uncovers mass incarceration's hidden history while documenting its human cost. Beautifully written, powerfully argued, and most of all, deeply empathetic. Okay? Locking Up Our Own should be read by everyone who cares about race and justice in America, Van Jones. And Brian Stevenson says, Locking Up Our Own is an engaging, insightful, and provocative re-examination of over-incarceration in the Black community. James Foreman Jr. carefully exposes the complexities of crime, criminal justice, and race, and what he illuminates should not be ignored. That's from Brian Stevenson. So James is a professor of law at Yale Law School and former clerk for Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. James, we love you. Let's go on in. Talk to us, and then we will open it up for Q&A. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that introduction. Nikichi says that she's been following me, but really I think the truth is I'm the one that's been following her. And I have proof, because in this book, on page 205, Nikichi Taifa is cited and quoted, and I want you to understand not just that she's cited, but I want you to hear what she said and when she said it. I'm talking now here about the Sentencing Project. Shout out to the Sentencing Project. I'm talking about their report in the 90s, the first report documenting the 1 in 4 young Black men under criminal justice supervision, their first report. And then I say, the report was widely disseminated and discussed, especially by Black commentators, with the ACLU's Nikichi Taifa, for example, comparing the double standard in American criminal justice to slavery and Jim Crow. 1994. So she's been on it. She's been on it. I want to also thank the Open Society Foundations. A grant supported the writing of this book, and a group of people came together in this office a couple of years ago, which Nikichi hosted, to give me feedback on an early draft of some chapters. And I mean, this room is full of people who are my heroes, the people whose work is cited throughout this book. But I just have to give a particular shout out to PDS, the Public Defender Service representatives here, because that is my heart. It's where I started. I'm going to tell a story about my work at PDS. And in a lot of ways, this book, I was on a panel about this book in Baltimore the day before it was released, and Judge Andre Davis, retired judge on the Fourth Circuit, said that one of the things he liked about this book, he said, was that he felt like I was fair to everybody, but I was also critical of everybody. And when he made that comment, I realized that as much as I embraced it, any author wants compliments, that he was wrong in one way, which is there's one group of people that is not criticized in this book, and that is public defenders. This is a love letter. This is a love letter to public defenders. And I didn't even mean it that way, but it's just my bias because that's the role that I'm playing in the story, right? So let me, what I want to do is I just want to spend a couple of minutes talking about why I decided to write the book, a few minutes on the main kind of arguments of the book, and then just wrap up with what I see as some of the implications. I'll be shorter on the implications part with this group than I normally would be, because the policy expertise in the room is greater than mine, and so I feel a little like ridiculous, trying to tell y'all what we should be doing when it's you who know the best. But I'll just spend a couple minutes on that. So I really had two motivations for writing the book. One of them had nothing to do with the criminal justice system. Oh, and I should just say by way, one more introductory thought, which is that I have just a few copies of the book. This space was so full and so crowded that we didn't even have room to bring a bookseller today. But at the end of the session, I will be out there in the alcove. I have about 6 or 7 copies, and cash and credit card are accepted. So if anybody wants to buy and get a copy signed, or if anybody has one and you want it signed, I'll be out there for that. But I should say that my motivations, one of them had nothing to do with the criminal justice system. And I don't know if anybody else in the room is like this, but I'm the kind of person who, if I go to a film and there's no black characters in the film, when it's over and somebody says, well, how did you feel about the movie? My first reaction is always, where were the black characters? And I feel that way not just about film, I feel that way about literature, I feel that way about art, I feel that way about history, I feel that way about law. So I knew that when I wrote my first book, I wanted to write a book that had African American characters front and central in the narrative. Now, the other reason was very much related to the criminal justice system. So there's, as Van said in his nice endorsement, there are a lot of stories in this book. And one of the stories that I tell from Superior Court is of a client of mine named Brandon. Brandon was a teenager charged with possession of a gun. He had pled guilty, possession of a gun and possession of a small amount of marijuana, about $15, $20 worth. And I was his lawyer representing him. And I had taken the job because I viewed this as the civil rights work of my generation. We didn't have the term mass incarceration yet. This is the mid-1990s. But we did know from the Sentencing Project that 1 in 4, and then they came out 1 in 3, young African-American men under criminal justice supervision. We did have commentators like Nikichi pointing out the double standards and hearkening back to earlier historical eras. My parents met in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. My dad's African-American, my mom is white, my dad was the executive secretary. They came together in a union at a time when, and I have to honor Loving versus Virginia here, they came together when interracial marriages were illegal in many states, and the anniversary of Loving was yesterday. So I come out of that tradition, and I also come having benefited from their work. There I am, clerking on the Supreme Court, getting to be a lawyer at the Public Defender Service, things that were not imaginable to somebody of my father's generation, a black man growing up in Jim Crow in Mississippi and in Chicago as he did. And at the same time, those numbers that we all know are starting to be reported. And I knew it from my own growing up in Atlanta, that a lot of kids that I went to high school with were not making it, and for too many of them, the reason was getting caught up in the criminal justice system. So the charge to me seemed obvious. So I'm representing Brandon, and I'm asking for him to be released. His mom and grandmother are there in court. They've been in court every single court hearing, standing up for him. I have a letter from a teacher, and I have a letter from a counselor at school testifying to his good character. Is his first arrest. Brandon, like almost all my clients in DC and Superior Court, is African American. The prosecutor asking for him to go to Oak Hill. And just pause, there's a lot of young faces in this crowd, but there's also people that have been around DC and know Oak Hill. Oak Hill was DC's juvenile facility, and it was really a dungeon. No functioning school, no programs worth their name, and some of the people around this table are responsible for getting it closed. And congratulations to that effort. But it's still open when I'm in court with Brandon, and the prosecutor's asking him to go there. The prosecutor's also African American. The judge that has to make the decision in the case, Judge Curtis Walker, and I should say, I changed the names of the clients, lawyers, and judges in all of these stories to protect their confidentiality. Judge Curtis Walker is looking out of the courtroom. He's got a young black man on trial who pled guilty facing sentencing, 2 African-American lawyers arguing different sides of the case. He, the judge, is himself African-American. And he looks into Brandon and he says, son, Mr. Foreman has been telling me that you've had a difficult life and you deserve a second chance. Well, let me tell you about tough. Let me tell you about Jim Crow. Son, people fought, marched, and died for you to be free. Dr. King died for your freedom. And I tell you this, he didn't die for you to be running and gunning and thugging and carrying on and embarrassing your family and embarrassing your community. No, that was not his dream at all. So I hope Mr. Foreman is right. I hope you turn it around. But right now, son, actions have consequences. And your consequence is Oak Hill. He locked him up. And that wasn't the only time in DC as a public defender that I had been in a courtroom where many of us were African Americans. But there was something about that case in particular and his invocation of Dr. King. See, the same person that I was drawing inspiration, I thought I was the King figure in the story, right? I'm the one that's fighting the civil rights issue of my generation. And he's using the same history to reach an opposite conclusion. And so it seems to me at that moment that there's a story that needs to be told. Somebody needs to write a story to tell the history with empathy, with compassion, with humanity, but also where appropriate with criticism of how it is that many of us in our community came to endorse some of the same tactics that the nation was pursuing in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. And that was the book that I wanted to write. So, having asked the question, why, right? Why did this community come to lock up so many of its own? Because at the time, the incarceration rate in DC, Eric helped to write a report showing that picking up on what the Sentencing Project had found and showing that in DC, the 1 in 3 number was 1 in 2. And this is with the city council now, because this judge is not alone. The city council that passed the laws that Brandon was sentenced under, the gun and the drug laws, majority African-American city council. Police force, mostly black. Police chief then, African-American, and had been since Bertel Jefferson, 1979. So, how? How did this happen? There's three, kind of, a lot of arguments in the book, but we've only got so much time. I'm going to focus on three. The first thing that we really have to grapple with is crime, violence, addiction, the toll that they took on black communities. In my opinion, too many of us who are critical of mass incarceration and over-punishment and over-punitiveness, we pass over. We might mention, there's a sentence or two about crime, and then we move on. But this book dwells on it because I think that the community was consumed by it. That's what my research shows. So homicide, remember now, my book picks up really in the mid-70s. This first generation of African-American officials in DC, the first home rule city council was elected in 1975. Nationwide, there's an 800% increase in African-American elected officials in the 1970s, I'm sorry. But what's right before they come in is the 1960s, and the largest decades-long crime rise in American history. The homicide rate increases 300% in DC in the 1960s. It doubles nationally. Heroin addiction. When I talk to my students today about the war on drugs, some of them will remember crack. I think that commercial came out during the crack years, the war on, this is your brain on drugs, I'm not sure. But what not a lot of people remember, at least the younger people, is that heroin was the crack before crack. Devastated black communities. In DC in 1963, they tested everybody entering the DC jail for heroin. 3% of the people were heroin addicts. By 1969, that 3% had become 45%. That's an epidemic. And it's not just, right, the numbers. We see that then happen again in the crack years. It's also the pain and the anguish and the fear that those numbers generate in a community. One of the things that I did is a lot of the DC Council members have turned their papers over to libraries around DC, GW, Howard, Martin Luther King branch of the DC Public Library. And when you look through those papers, which are not easily organized for a researcher because they're not organized by subject matter, they're organized by address. So you have to look at every address that anybody ever wrote a letter from to find, and when you pull out those letters though, you find a lot of letters about drugs and violence. People saying, I feel like a prisoner in these are 1970s, black citizens writing to their newly elected black representatives, saying, I feel like a prisoner in my own home. I feel like a stranger on my streets. I can't go outside and take my kids to school because of the drug dealers on the corner. They're shooting in the park. I don't even want to leave my kid in the park. And there's dirty syringes there. And then over and over again, do something. Do something. You have to do something about this. Now, Who's receiving these letters? This is the second big argument in the book. The folks that are receiving these letters are this first generation of African-American elected officials. Many of them from the South, some of them from the civil rights movement. All of them remember the deep history, profound and long history of under-enforcement of law and under-protection in African-American communities. They remember the history that led to 911 is a joke. They remember that you didn't call the police in black communities in the 1940s, 1950s. They weren't going to come, and if they did, they were just going to make matters worse. They remember Southern sheriffs in cahoots with the Klan said, that's not murder, that's just another dead black person. And they did not use the words black person. So now, here they are in office. They are bound and determined to respond to those letter writers, to give that community that is begging for protection the answer that they never got under Jim Crow. And this is just a pause here. One thing that I think my book does, if it does nothing else, it is to absolutely demolish the lie that you hear that the black community only cares about violence and crime when it's police officers. You know, you hear that from the right. How come they never complain about crime in their own communities, right? How come they only complain when it's, well, those letters that I just mentioned and the response from those representatives, there's 240 pages of proof in this book that that is a lie, that we have always cared about crime and violence in our communities, regardless of who's doing the crime. Okay, so they care, right? They care and they want to respond, and many of this first generation of elected officials, prosecutors, police chiefs, judges, they're like the judge that I said in the opening story, Judge Walker. They see the protection of the community as a civil rights issue. Okay, fine. But why with police? Why with prosecutors, right? So I get you, right? You want to protect the community, and crime and violence are real. But why was that the go-to answer, right? And that gets to the third big argument in the book. This is a book. I said up front I wanted to write a book with African-American characters front and central. But in America, with its history of racism and white supremacy, and with us as 12% of the population, any book that's about African-American characters is also going to be about the constraints and the limitations that they were under. Right? The people that I'm writing about didn't have all the power that they wanted or needed to solve this problem. So let's talk about what some of those constraints are. The first constraint that this group of African-American officials is under is historical, right? The history of racism that includes redlining and Jim Crow and deindustrialization and the vacuuming out of wealth of black communities that Ta-Nehisi Coates has written about so eloquently, to the point where the neighborhoods that this group of elected officials is responsible for protecting don't have enough resources to protect themselves, right? So that's the first constraint. In a lot of ways, you could think of this book as, Jelani Cobb, we did a panel, the writer for The New Yorker, we did a panel in New York, and he asked me a question which I've since turned into kind of a statement. He said, so is it fair to say that the people that you're writing about had the power to respond to crime, but they lacked the power to respond to the underlying conditions that generate crime? And my answer was yes, and it's a great question, and it's an important point. Okay, the second constraint. This is a political one, and it will be well understood to everybody in this room, a lot of y'all who work on both local, state, and national issues. The people that I'm writing about, overwhelmingly, their power was local. These are local elected officials. And although one of my big arguments is that when we think about criminal justice reform, we need to focus on the local, it's also true that there are limitations, of course, to what cities can do. So you see this over and over again. Black community representatives, activists, elected officials that I'm writing about, they'll say, we want an all of the above strategy to fighting crime. Yes, we want more police and we want more prosecutors. And sometimes even people will say we want longer sentences and more prisons. But we also want to fight racism. We want better schools. We want an investment in housing. We want drug treatment. We want mental health programs. We want after-school programs. They have an all of the above strategy, but for so many of those things, they need support from Congress. They say, when they passed the local gun control law in DC, they said, we also want national gun control. Needed Congress to do that. That doesn't happen. Because at the national level, there isn't that same care and concern for those letter writers that I described. Those don't register in the same way at the congressional level. People over and over again say, we want a Marshall Plan for urban America. I hear that for 50 years. It's throughout the record. We want America to invest in its black communities the same way America invested in Europe after World War II. Doesn't happen. So they wanted all of the above, and they got one of the above, which was law enforcement. And the last constraint that I want to identify is constraint of imagination. So one of my main arguments in this book is that some of how mass incarceration developed, we can look to villains, right? There are villains in the story. There are people who actively wanted to suppress and oppress African Americans. But there's also a story about people who aren't villainous, but are still constrained in all kinds of ways, including constrained by imagination. So one of the examples that I use in the book for this is Dave Clark. For folks that have been around this city for a while, the name Dave Clark will mean something. He was, when DC Council first got home rule in 1975, there were 13 members on the council, 11 African American, 2 white. Dave Clark was one of the 2 white members. Graduate of Howard Law School, worked with Martin Luther King, lawyer for poor people, gets on the city council. Dave Clark's first thing in office is to fight for marijuana decriminalization. For those of y'all that are interested in drug policy, chapter 1 of the book is about an attempt in 1975 to decriminalize marijuana, led by Dave Clark. It almost passes. Why it doesn't, I think, is a fascinating story, but that one I'm going to have to save for the book. But now, a few years later, early 1980s, Dave Clark's chair of the city council. He's getting bombarded with letters from citizens. The heroin crisis has returned in the late 70s, early 80s. People are saying, there's addicts in front of my house and I don't want to leave my house because they're hanging out. There's addicts in front of my business and they're keeping customers away. Do something. So Dave Clark does what we would all want our elected representative to do. He forwards that letter to the head of the relevant government agency to deal with the problem. He then gets a response back from the head saying, I'm on it. And he then forwards that response back to the citizen. So imagine, as a citizen, that's good, right? You're like, I wrote my representative, they took action, now I'm reading about what they're going to do. Who did he send it to? Did he send it to the head of the Department of Mental Health? Department of Addiction Services? No, he sent the complaint about addicts on the corner. Of course, this being America and us being constrained by our imaginations, he sent it to the police chief. Because in this country, we think of those problems. Even those of us like Clark who are not drug warriors, we have come to, we have been acculturated to, we have been conditioned to, taught to think about that issue as a public safety issue that requires law enforcement, not as a public health issue that requires community services. So that's how we got here, I argue. How much time do we have?
15 minutes.
We need to
Q&A.
I'm going to stop here. What I am not going to talk about, because we're out of time, but would love to continue this conversation, and there's some of this in the book, is responding to that, right? What are the implications of this history for how we respond now, right? How we resist, dismantle, over punitive criminal justice system and mass incarceration and replace it with something that is healing, that is meaningful, that gives people safety and gives people justice without producing the incredible, devastating community costs that mass incarceration has brought to America. Thank you.
Let's give it up. Thank you. Now, if that didn't inspire you to go on and get the book, I don't know what will. We were going to do Q&A like this. I need you to go to where Jasmine Mickens, the Senior Policy Associate there. Raise your hand high, Jasmine. We're going to line up there so we can get a feel for how many. We have about 15 minutes for Q&A. So go on over there, and she will, you will address your question or comment on the mic. And, yeah, thank you. It's, I really want to get a feel. So if you have a question or comment, line up there. And if you don't, it's fine. But just
Howard Wooldridge from LEAP. Two things. One, in the last vote in the House, we still had 4 members of the Congressional Black Caucus and 4 or 5 in the Hispanic Caucus vote to continue the war on drugs, war on marijuana without any interruptions. So you still have work to do at the federal level. Secondly, in order to reduce essentially all the problems in the black community in regards to contact with the police, I would urge you and anybody here to work on decrim every drug in the District of Columbia. There are people on the council who are interested in that. We almost had a meeting a week ago. We're going to reschedule it. But reducing the contact between the police and the community is going to improve conditions all the way around.
thank you. And introduce yourself, Charlie.
Charlie Sullivan with CURE. I just, for the record, want to say that we would have the death penalty right now on the books if it wasn't for Dave Clark and Diane Russ Tierney. And that was in the early 90s where there was a real move to have the death penalty. And because of their work and a lot of people who assisted them, we voted in D.C. 2-1 against the death penalty, which was really a great national message as well.
Thank you so very much for that, Charlie.
Thank you, Kevin Pogojan from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. Thank you, Professor Foreman, for your talk. My question is, how do you get politicians today or local leaders to sort of resist the half-loaf approach to justice? Because even today, in spite of our knowledge of mass incarceration, we still see, so you think about immigration reform, and there was because I think there was an idea that if we deport away everyone or the bad folks, we'd get some sort of comprehensive immigration reform, which didn't really materialize. You see that with healthcare. Maybe you take this sort of private sector oriented approach, and maybe later on we'll get a better public option, but that never really materialized. And that's kind of how I see some of the local leaders with the criminal justice issue. Maybe if we deal with deal with the dangerous folks, and then maybe later on we'll get a more comprehensive approach to criminal justice reform. But that never actually happened. So how do you get them to, even today, to sort of see that this is not probably the best way forward?
Yeah, let's hear all the questions, and he'll respond globally. Thank you.
My name is Eric from the Braxton Institute. I'm really grateful that you brought up the word imagination. I think about these issues in terms of public health and in terms of issues of bioethics. And so my question is, how do we, in a transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary way, cultivate moral imagination in the seats of power where it is so lacking? Because it's not like moral imagination is not in this room right now, right? But how do we communicate expansive imagination for justice in ways that it will land and in ways that it will actually trigger new possibility?
James, thanks so much. Congratulations, man.
Thank you, Damon. Thank you for your work.
Oh, please. So 2 things. One is my colleague Morgan Shannon and I, who's over here at the other side of the room, we went to twin convenings last week in New York, focused on reimagining justice and safety. And this notion came up about how safety means more than just being free from violence. Yeah. And I wonder if this is a Beltway-esque crowd, and I wonder if in your research and your trails, your travels, you encounter some of the new wave of activists and organizers who are themselves reimagining justice. The other question is somewhat related, which is, I'm sure you heard along the way that, hey, James, this is a in-house conversation in the black community.
You asked this question.
And so I just want you to just talk about how you wrestled with that, and how did it inform what you wrote and how you shared it.
Thank you.
Okay, last question.
Jessalyn McCurdy, ACLU. Did you find when you were doing your research around the black community back, 20, 30, 40 years ago, when they were asking for help to keep their communities safe, were they asking for people to be locked up? Because even in our advocacy today, a lot of the times the response that we get from Republicans is they want these people locked up. They want to keep their communities safe. And so it may be an issue of, again, lack of imagination again, back when this, the calls for public safety in communities were happening. But it's interesting to me that we still get that kind of backlash today that they want these people locked up. And so I was just curious about that.
Yeah. Okay, that's a really rich set of questions, and I appreciate everybody asking them. I'm going to take them a little bit out of order if it's okay. I want to start with one of Damon's questions, his second question, because I think it's such an important one. And it's one that I sometimes talk about in my kind of opening comments, and I didn't this time, and so I feel like it's really important to elevate it. Right, so Damon says, did you ever get, pushback like this is, should be an in-house conversation? And there's different forms of that, right? So another way of asking the question is, do you ever feel like, and it's actually connected to the very last comment, do you ever feel as if by talking about the African-American support, and I should say, by the way, that when you read the book, I think one of the things that comes through is that at each moment these things are contested. So every single battle that I describe, there's another side, right? That Nkechi's in the book, right? Because there are people like her making those arguments in the 90s, in the 80s, in the 70s. I said marijuana decriminalization didn't pass, but there was a lot of African-American support for decriminalization, right? So these are close votes. And so the complexity of the sort of the community's feeling, I think, is represented in these pages. But having said that, at the end of the day, right, it is a story like most kind of historical accounts. It is a story that focuses more on the winners, and in this last 40 and 50-year period, the winners of legislative battles have generally been the people that wanted longer drug sentences or wanted mandatory minimums, et cetera, right? So the question is, by focusing on that within the African American community, do you somehow move? Well, there's two questions. One is, do you move responsibility away from the story of racism and white supremacy as motivating these decisions, which has gotten so much traction in recent years, and which is a really important one because it's true and for a lot of our advocacy efforts, right, is one. And also, do you then legitimate some of the choices that have been made by suggesting, well, if if African American leaders supported it, then these must be good ideas, right? Those are two separate, but I think related points. So I thought about this question constantly from the time I first started writing the book. I mean, when Nkechi said she was first heard about the title and she was wondering, what is this going to be? Like, it's not like she didn't share that with me, right? And that was, y'all know Nkechi, like she told me. And she wasn't alone, and I didn't even need her to, like, I was also thinking about it myself. So for me, I think so my starting point was that I believe that we are capable of holding two ideas in our head at the same time. I know I can and do, and then I believe that other people can as well. So I believe passionately and fervently that you cannot understand the history of this country, and you certainly cannot understand the history of what's happened in our criminal justice system without understanding racism and all of its deep, pernicious effects from, I mean, at almost every level. The first case that I did, even before I worked at the legal defense, before I worked at PDS, was a summer intern at Damon's old organization, NAACP Legal Defense Fund. This is when I was a law clerk, and I worked with Steve Hawkins on a death penalty case in Utah of a guy who our client was sentenced to death by an all-white jury and judge in Utah, and when the case was over, they found a note in the jury room that had, jurors were playing the hangman game, and they had 6 letters at the bottom, and N and I were filled out. And we were trying to get that conviction reversed on appeal. So that reality is well known to me. Obviously, the stories that the history that we know of Goldwater and Nixon, and talking about race and talking about crime when you couldn't talk about race anymore, and signaling to people that, yeah, I know, I got you, you know, we're after the blacks here, even though you can't say it. That history is absolutely true, and it's powerful, and it's not the whole story, even though it's most of the story. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to tell the rest of the story. Or another piece, because there's, you know, an academic, there's never the rest. You've never answered it. There's always more. But I wanted to tell another piece of the story. I wanted to understand how, alongside that history, I wanted to understand somebody like Judge Walker. And I wanted to understand the decisions that were being made by a city council that my colleagues and I at PDS were constantly going and arguing in front of, and are still arguing to this day. The question came up about are still arguing to this day and facing great hostility, trying to create a more humane criminal justice system. So I felt like it was possible to hold both of those truths out there at the same time. And so then I felt like the challenge was to write it and then talk about it in such a way that made that clear, right? Because there's a way that you could write this, right, that wouldn't make that clear. There's a way that, and so I wanted to be absolutely clear in the presentation and the framing that of exactly the argument that I was making. And then on the point of, well, by talking about this, are then you suggesting that it's a good idea, the way that I respond to that is, this is a book of history, but each of the chapters is surrounded by a story. And the story is a story from my practice as a public defender, where you can see the devastating consequences that these actions have had. So when I tell the story of how mandatory minimums for gun and drug offenses in DC were passed in 1981 by voter referendum, citywide voter referendum. The city council got rid of the drug ones in 1994, 15 years later, but the gun ones remain. Now, I tell that story, the history of how that came to be, right? And the two sides, and there were, ACLU was opposed, and the Urban League was opposed, and the NAACP was opposed, right? So there were two sides, but it passed. But I tell that story embedded in a story from my practice of a woman that I represent who's facing one of these incredibly long sentences, doesn't have access to drug treatment, is told by the prosecutor, well, you've tried and failed with drug treatment before, why would we give you another shot? To which I say, well, why do we never evaluate prison by that standard? And I embed the history in that account so that I make it clear to the reader. Nobody could pick that up and think that I think what happened was good, right, was beneficial to the African American community. I can write about it and I can explain it while still making clear my position, how harmful that it's been. So that's how I try to deal with that. And I would love, and this is the final thing I'll say on it. As you can see, this is a really big issue for me. Everybody so far that has read the book has had Nkechi's reaction, that is to say, I had some of these reservations, I read how you did it, and I think this is a contribution. And so what I would ask anybody who's kind of worried on the grounds that you just mentioned, my plea would be read. And if when you're done, you're like, you know what, I still have my same, I don't think you pulled it off, then I want to have that conversation, right? Because as a writer, one of the things I want is criticism. That's how we get better, right? Right? We all know that's what made the cabinet meeting so absurd that you were joking about, is you don't get better if people are just agreeing with you. So, okay, so how much time do we have left? Oh, wow, I have 1 minute. I'm just going to, let me just say quickly, agree on Dave Clark and the death penalty. I almost had a chapter on the death penalty in the book. It ended up getting edited out because I just didn't have enough. But that history that you described is absolutely correct. I've researched it, and I honor Dave Clark's role there.
Yeah, I was there for part of that at the ACLU with Diane Russ Tierney back in the day.
The last thing that I'll say, and it's only because I don't have time, some of these other, I'm just going to say a point about resisting half the loaf. To me, my way to resist half the loaf is to try to get people to read this book, because they would see that it didn't work. Like, I don't know how to convince people but to show them that we tried that. We tried the, okay, I'll do the more policing and I'm going to get the money for schools, right? We've been bamboozled. Like, it doesn't happen. It does not happen ever, which is different from a different kind of half the loaf. There's a different half the loaf, which is that we have 100 to 1 and we want it to be 1 to 1, and well, we can only get down, the 18 to 1. That's to me a different kind of, because that is right now immediately helping people, and now then you keep pushing. So it depends to me on the kind of half the loaf that we're talking about. Last thing I'll say on cultivating imagination, a lot of work to be done. To me, if there's one thing that we can do, and I know some organizations in this room are doing it, it's elevate returning citizens and people with criminal convictions in the policy discussion. Glenn Martin is right when he says that the people that are closest to the problem are closest to the solution. And the imagination, I gave a book talk in San Quentin last week. 80 guys, 50 of them had read the book. The imagination in that room about criminal justice reform was powerful. We need to tap into it. Thank you.
One more time for James Foreman Jr. Locking up our own. Crime and punishment in Black America. Phenomenal. Thank you.
I appreciate it. Can I stay for the meeting?
Yes. So we're going to continue with our meeting, and after the meeting, directly after, you'll be able to get your book signed, okay? So, as I said, the nuts and bolts, the daily work of the Justice Roundtable Assembly is carried out by its various working groups. And in case you missed it, this is the Justice Roundtable's roadmap to criminal justice reform, executive and legislative recommendations from the Justice Roundtable working groups. You can find it at www.justiceroundtable.org. At one point, it was going to be a little bit different, and then the election happened, and so it's a roadmap as opposed to a transition document. Okay, but it came out in January, so in case you missed it, it said justiceroundtable.org. And be sure to visit us on social media, hashtag Justice Roundtable, or at Justice Roundtab, or Facebook Justice Roundtable. Twitter. Did I say that? At Twitter. Yes, it's all good. You got it. If you all watching this on live stream, you already know what to do and how to get there. So we're going to start with our working group reports. As we know, we do a rocket docket. We do a general overview or update with respect to what's going on. And if anybody who's not part of the working group has any question or anything like that, we will entertain that. But we're going to start with our law enforcement reform working group, and I'd like to call on Kanya Bennett, who's the co-chair of that working group. And if you look at the screen, if you are wanting to get in contact with one of the co-chairs and find out how you can plug in the specific information as well as the email for the working group chairs are up there. So Kanya, share it.
I want to give a recap of Police Week, which was last month. It was May 14th through May 19th. So we'll start with what the administration did. So in addition to issuing the traditional executive order that recognizes Police Week, Trump also signed an EO directing DOJ to develop a strategy to better prevent and prosecute crimes against law enforcement. So I don't think that it means much other than further messaging to the Department of Justice, which many of you know already has a policing working group that was established through a previous EO to look at crimes against law enforcement. So we continue to watch what's coming out of the administration with respect to the law and order narrative and try to see what this work looks like with respect to this interagency DOJ-led working group on crimes against law enforcement. We also spent a lot of time organizing around divisive policing bills that were advanced during Police Week. Many of you know the House passed the Thin Blue Line Act. That's H.R. 115. And on the Senate side, it is S 1085. So that is Buchanan's bill and Toomey's bill. And that makes homicide against law enforcement an aggravating factor for the federal death penalty. It passed by 271 to 143. The House also passed the Probation Officer Protection Act, which gives federal probation officers third-party arrest authority. That's Representative Reichert's bill on the House side and Pascrell Adi from New Jersey. On the Senate side, it's Hatch and Feinstein, and that's S 367. And so that passed the House. We had a better vote there. That was 229 to 177. And given the sort of bipartisan nature of the issue, though on the House side we had some help from the Liberty Caucus in terms of opposition, there's some likelihood that this bill could actually move. And so we continue to engage the Hill, place op-eds, continue other media. We lift up the voices of law enforcement leaders to oppose these two bills, given they've come out of the House. And we certainly don't want to see them move in the Senate, as Reggie knows. We've chatted with him. We also saw the Back the Blue Act introduced, and there are many in this room that are organizing around it for various reasons. There are many bad provisions in it, from the mandatory minimums for all kinds of crimes committed against law enforcement. It includes the Thin Blue Line Act as a provision. It limits habeas. It limits 1983 accountability. It's S 1134 on the Senate side. It's Cornyn's bill, and it's HR 2437 on the House side. It's Poe's bill. And so we have not received any signals that this bill is going to move. I'm looking at Reggie, and he's shaking his head. But we all know that it will take just one incident, and you already have these bills introduced and ready to go. And with Thin Blue and the Probation Officer Protection Act, you already have those bills passed by the House. So one positive thing to share with respect to legislation: Cory Booker on May 25th introduced the PRIDE Act, and that's a mandatory data collection and reporting bill on police force, also force against police. ACLU, Leadership Conference, LDF, and some others in the room support the bill. It is a new and improved bill from the last Congress, where it was a discretionary sort of pilot programming and funding of data collection. This, again, is mandatory. So we continue to work with Booker and others on some positive policing bills that can be used to respond to the many divisive bills that are coming out. Our next working group meeting is this Thursday at 12, and it's here at OSF, so look forward to seeing a lot of you all there.
Okay, thank you so very much, Kanya. Any questions for law enforcement reform? Okay, we're going to move right on to cremation, and Jasmine Mickens, in addition to being my senior policy associate here at Open Society, she's the guru behind our new cremation working group. Jasmine.
All right, good morning, everybody. So I'll give a quick update. For those of you who don't know, the Cremation Working Group is a working group that works at the intersection of immigration and criminal justice, given that these two systems are continuing to merge into one, and there's some disturbing entanglements. Recently, I was actually just at the border last week. We were doing a border tour to really get a sense of what is happening on the border. So the group we'll kind of reconvene to kind of debrief each other on our different reactions. But I would say the two takeaways from that experience was, one, getting to talk to CBP, Customs, Border and Patrol, to really understand their perspective of the work they do, and to also, challenge them on some of the criticisms some of us in this room have of the way they police on the border. And then also, it was interesting talking to the people who are taking this journey on the border for very different reasons, and understanding better what their challenges are. So what the working group is hoping to do, given that everybody in the immigration space is being pulled in many directions right now with all that's going on, with terrible legislation, terrible executive orders, we as a working group are going to focus on how we can build power on the local level. There's a lot of great things going on in different areas of the country, especially in some of these border states, but there's also a need for support and capacity. So we're continuing to scan what the actual needs of the impacted people are and coordinating that with some of the federal strategists that are on our working group so that they can be more in tune and knowledgeable about how the systems are working in DC. So we have a more coordinated strategy. Our next working group meeting will probably be next week. I don't have a date right now, so I will add you to the working group if you want to get more information. But since there's so many things going on, we've had a lot of ad hoc meetings as needed, and there's kind of a lot of subcommittees going on. So we're hoping that we can pull everybody together again sometime soon. But I'll keep you all posted, and I would really appreciate any opportunities to collaborate with a lot of the working groups. So Kanya, I'll be hitting you up soon so that we can look at some of the law enforcement components that are increasingly problematic. Thank you.
Great, thank you so very much, Jasmine. Any questions for cremation working group? We're going to move right along to sentencing reform in between Jocelyn McCurdy or Kara Gott.
Kara and Michael.
Michael
we're gonna
Collins.
So, the big news that came down a few weeks ago, not unexpected, but was Sessions releasing his new guidance around sentencing and charging, the way they were going to charge crimes under this new administration. The Justice Roundtable had sent a letter ahead of time asking the Department of Justice, just mainly to put ourselves on the record around touting the successes of the Smart on Crime guidance that was enacted by Attorney General Holder and continued by Attorney General Lynch. But we had been hearing for months, actually, that the charging guidance was going to be changed, and it was officially dated May 10th, but released publicly May 12th. And I think, kind of somewhat surprisingly, and Kara can talk some more about this, really got some really good reactions from members of Congress in papers across the country, just really pushing back on Sessions taking this new old approach, because basically what he's doing is taking us back to when there was the Ashcroft memo, when people were going to be charged with the most serious crime that could be proven by prosecutors. So that has come out. I think we got some good responses around that. And Kara, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about that.
Well, we also held a rally, most people know, and really do appreciate all the.
Tell a little bit more about the rally, because we have a whole live stream audience who may not.
So we
know
held a
about that.
rally. The following Tuesday really became public Friday morning, and we got on the phone pretty quickly, and had a rally in front of the Department of Justice, And a lot of you were there. Really want to thank everybody for coming together. We had about 125 people there, and a series of speakers, including Nikichi and Jesslyn and Mark Maurer and Jasmine Tyler and Sakira Cook and lots of people. It was really energizing and a good reminder of this community strength and commitment. And we've been down before, and we can rise again. So I would echo what Justin said, that there's been really great as in a negative response, pretty in the media. And last week, actually, Senator Lee led a letter to Sessions that was signed by Cory Booker, Rand Paul, and Dick Durbin, to Sessions, asking for justification for revocation of the Smart on Crime initiative, and was critical of the Department of Justice. And they really, to their credit, led on this. Lee's office led on this, and were really upset about the Department of Justice's actions. Yeah.
And I want to first of all, I want to welcome Jasmine Tyler back into the fold, but specifically want to thank her for really putting the energy into the protest, because, I mean, this was literally a pop-up protest. Yeah, we had to calm her down on that. We had to veto that. Right, we had to veto that. And then, right, you would have got us out of jail. And then I want to ask, actually, Michael to talk about a meeting that we had with the Department of Justice a week before the guidance came out.
Yeah, so a group of us met with Steve Cook, who, for folks who don't know, is kind of like Jeff Sessions #2. He was like former NALSA, big opponent of sentencing reform, and now is in the Department of Justice. And he's heading up this task force on violent crime. And so we really had a meeting with him. Not really.
Excuse me, that includes marijuana.
That includes marijuana, the violent crime of marijuana. So, yeah, I mean, so we met with them, really, a group of us met with him, really not to kind of put across our point of view, because he's so far removed from where we stand, and he knows where we stand, we know where he stands, but really just to talk about, make sure that they are talking to the right people as they do this task force. So, yeah, I mean, the sense we got from these task forces is somewhat of an echo chamber. They're talking to law enforcement, prosecutors, and so we followed up by sending a list of individuals and folks that they should reach out to. And I think they have a summit on violent crime next week that none of us could get invited to.
We all got rejected.
We all got rejected.
We did see. Let me mention, before I turn it back over to Jesslyn, on justiceroundtable.org, there's a whole page. It's a take action page dealing with the whole Sessions scenario and the guidance memo to prosecutors that was basically resurrected that Jesselyn talked about. So if you want to see the various statements from the various organizations, I mean, tons of organizations around this table issue statements, in protest of that memo. If you want to see news articles related to it or anything along those lines, it's on that page on justiceroundtable.org under Take Action.
I'm done.
Any questions for sentencing reform working group? Yes. Turn it to a turn span.
I guess this is for Jesselyn or Kara. Do you see any significance to the fact that we don't have any U.S. attorneys in office? Like, does that help or hurt in terms of the impact of the guidance?
I'm going to let Michael talk about that, because we have been doing some work around the U.S. attorneys.
Yeah, actually, overnight or late yesterday, they announced the first raft of nominees. I think some of us we've been doing some meetings around U.S. attorney nominations. It's quite, I don't know how much detail I should go into because it's so boring, but essentially for U.S. attorney, for a lot of nominations, especially U.S. attorney nominations, there's what's called a blue slip process, where the senators from the state of which the U.S. attorney is being nominated have to approve that nominee. And so Grassley will reach out to senators from Massachusetts, for example, and say, do you like this guy? And so we've been meeting with Senate offices just to talk to them about, are they taking this process seriously? Here are, some potential questions that you might want to ask when you meet these U.S. attorneys. But my sense is they're very far behind in terms of nominating individuals, and I think that means that these sort of interim / deputy U.S. attorneys are in power just now, and that's not necessarily a bad thing from our point of view.
Okay.
Howard with LEAP. Everybody kind of snickered when they talk about violent crime and marijuana. As a policy, marijuana prohibition absolutely creates a fair amount of violence and death in this country. People are shot and killed at least every month in this country because of the marijuana prohibition. Just want to add that.
Okay. Thank you. We want to move right along to interfaith criminal justice, and our co-chairs aren't in the room at this point. I do know that working group has been working very hard, going up to the Hill, lobbying and talking to staffers. I don't know if there's anyone here, or Kara, or okay, good. John, can you report? Please pass.
Great, thanks, Nkichi. Primarily what we've been doing is going and meeting with various people in the Senate, including the guy who took over as Lee's chief counsel last November, and he had given us a heads up on the letter that was ultimately sent. And he pretty much indicated that, for what it's worth, that Senator Lee was pretty incensed by the letter that Attorney General Sessions kicked out, because they apparently had a meeting at the White House with trying to, figure out who's really setting criminal justice policy on the White House. And they felt really good about what they were told, and then 2 days later, Sessions sent that letter out. So they were pretty unhappy about that, whatever that means. In the House side, we've been targeting the Republican study group members and members of justice in the Judiciary Committee in the House. And pretty much, except for the guys that have been there for a really long time, we're hearing a lot of nobody really understands the issue that well. Just saying, particularly from some of the younger members. And so we're looking at kind of shifting gears on our education a little bit. We're going to be putting up a website and doing some other things, but that's the quick report out.
Okay, thank you. That was interfaith criminal justice. We want to move right into drug policy reform, and I know Michael Collins and earlier Jocelyn mentioned Jasmine Tyler, and welcome back to the fold. I just want to congratulate Jasmine, because she is now the advocacy director, or director of policy, I think it is, advocacy director, U.S. Advocacy Director for Human Rights Watch. She was my colleague here at the Open Society during drug policy. Now she's Human Rights Watch. Let's give it up, Jasmine Tyler. So between Michael Collins and Jasmine, I don't know how you want to deal with drug policy.
Do you want?
Just the one thing is that Nkichi mentioned the transition memo, or the, what are we calling it?
Roadmap.
Thank you. The roadmap, and the Drug Policy Working Group in May submitted the drug policy chapter to the Office of National Drug Control Policy, ONDCP, the Drug Czar's office, for their open comment period for the annual drug strategy that they write. We also submitted it for information for the Chris Christie, Kushner, whatever thing that has been created but is not active and is being staffed by ONDCP. So that's how that document, for instance, has been used recently. But Michael, do you want to pick up from there?
Yeah, so you might have some more to add on ONDCP. It's been a funny few months because they nominated the drug czar, and then they put out a sort of preliminary version of the budget that was almost completely defunding the drug czar's office, and then they reinstated the drug czar's office, and now there's then the drug czar nominee withdrew his name, and so there's currently no,
career staff is currently acting drug czar.
Yes, so
and has no interest in, I think, being the political drug czar.
So I would expect that at some point they will nominate someone else for the drug czar's job. So that's or not. That's it as far as ONDCP is concerned. On marijuana, like a number of developments, we're still waiting. We mentioned this sort of task force, which is concerning. We're still waiting on the Attorney General's office to issue new guidance on for states that have legalized marijuana. You know, the Obama administration had this Cole memo that was essentially a hands-off approach. The thinking is that Sessions will take a different approach, but we don't know what exactly. And then medical marijuana, which a lot of people thought was kind of relatively safe, given that we have like 30 states now that have legalized medical marijuana. But just in the last month or two developments, one was that there's an amendment that's been passed to protect states from federal interference from medical marijuana called the Rohrabacher-Farr Amendment. When Trump signed the most recent version of the budget, he issued a signing statement essentially saying, we don't have to adhere to that amendment, and that was concerning. And then yesterday, there was a leaked letter that Sessions had sent to the Appropriations Committee, essentially saying, don't bother including that amendment, I'm going to ignore it, and we don't like that amendment, etc., etc. So some worrying issues for medical marijuana as well as recreational marijuana. More bad news. There was an announcement both in the President's budget and in the Federal Register that the DEA wants to have its own team of prosecutors to specifically prosecute drug crimes. Traditionally, that work has been done by U.S. attorneys, but the DEA, sort of under the guise of the opioid epidemic, is saying that they now want to have their own team of, I think, somewhere like 16 to 20 prosecutors that would almost exclusively, they would exclusively do drug prosecutions. So just think of the damage that could do in terms of incarceration. Even more bad news. Last week, Senator Feinstein and Senator Grassley introduced a bill on synthetic drugs. Synthetic drugs are these kind of like variations of like fentanyl and heroin that are really plaguing the country in terms of overdoses. And this is a bill that would, initially the initial version of the bill that we had seen would had a new mandatory in there and lots of additional penalties. It's somewhat scaled back, but it's still very troubling. Still puts all these new synthetic drugs essentially in this gives them additional criminal penalties, as well as giving, perhaps most worryingly, giving Attorney General Jeff Sessions the ability to decide what drugs should receive these penalties. So a lot of latitude there. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
Yes, Howard.
Yeah, well, I have some cheerful news. Don Murphy of MPP did a head count for the first time ever. A majority of the members of the House of Representatives would vote to employ the 10th Amendment to end the federal prohibition of marijuana. That's a first. Then more bad news. I passed out to all 535 offices, plus 2 contacts in the White House 2 months ago, the Swiss program for medication-assisted treatment, which is highly regarded, highly successful, saves lives, etc. Essentially 0 response from anybody in the Congress or the White House.
Okay, and on that note, we're going to move to reentry. Jenny Collier, and I think Chris is out of town.
My co-chair, Chris Scott, can't be with us today, but my name is Jenny Collier, and the Reentry Working Group also has good news, so we'll start first with the good news. Second Chance Act reauthorization will be introduced this week for the first time this Congress, probably tomorrow or the next day. And discussions are happening in the Senate right now about their introduction with Senator Portman, and so Council of State Governments is the lead on that. The Reentry Working Group has so many issues that we often use meetings to share information. There are a lot of different groups and individuals who lead this work, so I'll often refer to people either in this room or who are partners of the Reentry Work Group who are leading the work so that you can follow up with them. If you are in question, please feel free to follow up with me. I'm here today. The REAL Act, which would lift the ban on Pell Grants for incarcerated individuals, is going to be introduced in the Senate, probably next work period in July by Senator Schatz, and a lot of different groups are working on that, and that's something that's already been introduced in the House, but I think, again, that's some good news. There is a lot of troubling news, I have to unfortunately say. In the Appropes realm, President had his FY18 budget proposal, which again is only a proposal. It's not a codification of any of these cuts, but I wanted to let people know about the priorities that he indicated that impact reentering individuals and their families. So overall, there would be $54 billion less funding for non-defense discretionary programs, which covers a lot of the housing, health, and social and education, labor, and welfare programs that we all care about that serve this community. And specifically, programs like Second Chance Act would be proposed to have a $20 million cut. There would be a massive $600+ billion cut to the Medicaid program, which in over 30 states, people coming out of prison oftentimes will automatically have access to Medicaid as their health care, which is a huge, as a part of the ACA's Medicaid expansion program. And so that would be a huge loss. Housing would be severely cut, and other labor, food, welfare, and education programs. And so we really need to pay attention to the budget. These cuts are serious, and we need to work with our partners around all non-defense discretionary programs to really fight these cuts. We're going to talk about these things periodically at the Reentry Working Group and encourage your participation as well as circulate information. There is a NDD United coalition meeting where Congressman Simpson, who is an appropriator from Idaho, a Republican, will be speaking about the budget process at the end of this month. I believe it's on Friday the 30th at 9. I've sent out the information and we'll send it again. I really encourage you all to come, and then there will be other updates by experts on these issues, including the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities. We also have been having fun trying to fight healthcare reform. Again, the American Health Care Act would also compound the president's proposed budget cuts with its own set of over $800 billion worth of Medicaid cuts, and it would make the total Medicaid cut at approximately $1.3 trillion between those two, the budget if it were enacted by the president, and then the House Healthcare Reform Bill, the American Health Care Act. So we really also need you to look out for sign-on opportunities. Mel Wilson from NASW is putting together a letter, I think, still. The vote on healthcare will probably be at the end of this month in the Senate. Date that's being discussed is June 28th. People, I don't know if that'll really happen. We'll have to see. But advocates are whipping now to really try and make sure that folks are hearing from constituents. And this is a program, again, through the Medicaid expansion program in particular, as well as through healthcare subsidies that have really benefited this community. And so it's important for us to fight back. Drug testing, Queen over here from DPA let us know about a bill from Representative Rouser in North Carolina, a federal bill that would expand drug testing for both the food stamp, SNAP, and welfare program, TANF, and public housing and Section 8. So that is not something that we want or need. And so I know that Queen and Elaine Elaine Weiss have been co-chairing a housing group that's been working also on some other housing legislation that relates to the reentering community. And so I defer, raise your hand, Queen, so for folks who can't see, I defer folks to them. I don't think Elaine's here, but Queen is from DPA, and she can take questions about folks who want to get active on that. And in terms of next steps, we're going to probably have a more overt discussion about collateral consequences that we started our discussion about last meeting, and our next meeting will be on Friday, July 14th at noon here at OSPC. We're now having our meetings approximately every 6 weeks, so look for notices. And again, my name is Jenny. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to direct you. Thanks.
Thank you so very much, Jenny. We're going to move right along. Jocelyn?
So there was a hearing a few weeks ago in the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. Did I get all this?
I'm not sure. I think we might be missing a seat.
I think I'm missing a seat. Around collateral consequences. And they are accepting comments until the
Is it this week?
19th. I believe.
Monday. Okay.
Yeah, Monday.
Okay.
And so if people are interested in submitting, I know the ACLU is going to submit some comments, and I know other organizations that I've talked to around town are going to submit comments. And so, in the comments, I think the hearings themselves were on collateral consequences, strictly focused on those who had been incarcerated, but the comments can be on any more broader than the hearings were. So the deadline, I believe, is June 19th. So make sure that if you're interested, you get your comments in by then.
Thanks, Jesselyn, for reminding me about that. I'd forgotten. And then also, we've encouraged people to use the roadmap that Nikichi talked about. The Reentry Working Group did a really robust section for reentry in that roadmap. So feel free to beg, borrow, and steal. It's online. You should be able to look at it, copy it. Many, many writers, authors, and experts contributed to that. So it's really a useful tool for folks who want to submit comments by Monday.
Okay, great. We're going to move right into the Prison Reform Working Group. Jesselyn?
And so I'm just going to make a few announcements, and then I'm going to ask actually Hayne and Charlie if you have anything that you'd like to add to the report. Okay, so the ACLU has been working closely with Senator Durbin's office to reintroduce his solitary confinement bill that he introduced last Congress. We're also working with them to so that we can have a hearing at the end of this month, possibly, even though time is ticking away, on the 27th or 28th. I'll let people know if we're able to pull that off by then, but we are still going to try to have a hearing before the August break around our report that was released in January, focused on people who are held in solitary confinement who suffer from different disabilities. And so I'll keep you up to date in terms of the time and date of that briefing. Also, we've been working closely with Senator Cardin's office so that because he is interested in reintroducing his private prisons FOIA bill, and that bill would basically force BOP to do a better job of monitoring the private prisons, and he is very close to being ready to reintroduce that bill. So now I'll turn it over to Hayne. Even though this is a prison report, Hayne has been doing some work around jails, and I thought that this would be a great opportunity for her to talk about that.
Thanks, Jesselyn. So today we released a report called Out of Sight, the Growth of Jails in Rural America, which is basically a report from our Incarceration Trends Project, which is supported by the MacArthur Foundation. We have a data tool called the Incarceration Trends Tool, and using this tool, what we found was that there's been a huge increase in the rise of jail incarceration around the country, but interestingly, it hasn't been in the big cities where the rate has actually been going down in recent years, but the highest rate of increase in the jail rate is in rural areas. So some key stats. Since 1970, the rural jail rate has gone up 436%, and it's mainly been in the South and the West. And in spite of these rates, it's not because these areas are experiencing higher crime rates. They actually have lower crime rates. And the rate of white Americans who have been incarcerated in jails has also been increasing rapidly. And of course, there's still this huge racial disparity, mainly people of color being incarcerated. There's been also a huge increase in the number of women being incarcerated in jails. And with rural areas, I think it's hard to say what the causes are because the causes are really local. But I think two general trends we're seeing is that rural areas generally have lack of resources, things like alternatives to incarceration and treatment. And there's also financial incentives to keep people in jails because they get paid for bed space from the federal authorities, but also from state prisons. So we have a briefing on Thursday, 1:30 to 3. It's going to be in the CVC room 215, and I'll send it out on the listservs. Thanks.
1 second. I think Charlie, and then go on.
I'm really pitch hitting for Annalise Hafer, who is our policy advisor here. She's really taking this issue on. In fact, she's home watching the testimony on television, on the computer, in regard to what's going on. The bad news is that really the chair, kind of the czar of the appropriations, Congressman Howard Rogers, is trying to place his fifth prison in East Kentucky, which is not located near any urban area. But the good news is, of all things, is the Trump budget says cancel it. $444 million he has appropriated
for this prison a couple of years ago, and they're saying forget it because the population of the Bureau of Prisons has gone down 30,000, a lot of that because of the Colson report. So it's a very, very important issue to have another high security prison when we don't need it, and to quit using prisons for economic development. That's why we ended up with Aliceville in Alabama, where we actually moved women prisoners from the Northeast down to Alabama away from their families. And so that's a very important issue, and you might be hearing more about it.
Okay, thank you. Howard.
Yeah, cheerful news. You didn't catch it last November. Oklahoma became the second state besides California to make all drug sentences for simple possession a maximum of 1 year in the county jail. And it was a 57-43 vote. Everyone around the table all across the nation should take notice of that the country is ready to go at least down to a 1 year misdemeanor. If not, as I said earlier, DC could lead the way and say, go total Portugal, total decrim. It's all, and by the way, Republicans are liking it, rightoncrime.com, because it's saving money and it doesn't affect crime rates.
I would just add to the comments about the Letcher prison and the Trump budget sort of explanation that they would pull back the $444 million is that, to add some more bad news to the conversation, unfortunately, is the reason they said that they would pull that back is that Thompson is imminently coming online and that they would also accommodate for extra growth with private prison contracts. So just to be careful about sort of threading the needle on that. Last time I talked to BOP, which was last week, about Thompson, they said they still don't know if it's going to be ADX-like in conditions. They don't know when it's coming online, and they don't know how much more money they need to open it. So cheerful black hole of information, just need to make sure, I think, that in saying, yes, get rid of Letcher, we also say, but also we don't need another ADX in rural Illinois.
Thank you. We're going to move right along to commutations and pardons, and Mark Osler is here. He's going to give our update on that.
All right. Thank you, Nikichi. And, you know, as Nikichi mentioned previously, the numbers are in from the Obama Clemency Initiative that 1,715 people got commutations, which is really remarkable, a historic use of this principled tool of the president. Bad news is that there's been nothing since January 20th, that there are over 11,000 clemency cases pending right now. As many of you know, with the support of Open Society and others, Rachel Barco and I started and ran the Clemency Resource Center and handled hundreds of cases, and we know who got it and who's still pending. And in many cases, the cases are indistinguishable from one another on any rational basis. So there's a real and deep tragedy to what's not happening as we've got this giant number of lives piling up. What's gone wrong? The pardon attorney, Larry Coopers, by all accounts, is continuing to process cases and make recommendations. But the steps in the process of evaluation above him are Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, and Doug McGahn, the White House counsel, both of whom, by all accounts, are pretty busy and not paying attention to this at all, which means that those numbers are going to continue to grow as petitions are filed. Now, is it worthwhile to add to that pile that's stacking up, probably in the DAG's office? Maybe. It depends on the case, but there's really not a reason, from what I'm able to discern, for hope that there's going to be a large number of grants anytime soon. So what to do? There's really four things that are worthwhile right now. And one is that, for many, many people who work with students on this, it might be worthwhile to take a look at compassionate release under 3582. Where that doesn't go through the president, and it's still the same kind of thing of developing a narrative and telling the whole story. Second, there are a lot of people rolling around Iowa right now thinking about running for president. What has gone wrong time after time after time is that when we have the political debate, when we have the discussions about who should be our president, we never talk about clemency. What we have an imperative to do is to raise that as soon as we can, early on. If you have a candidate that you support, if you have several that you're looking into, encourage them to develop this as a part of what they talk about, because it will be an issue once someone comes into office. Third, the states. There's a lot of opportunity to do good things in the states right now. And I'm tomorrow, in fact, going to go back to Minnesota and go to clemency hearings in our state. And one of the things that provides a real opportunity is that you might expect there'd be a red-blue divide, that blue states would have good clemency programs and red states would not. And that's not true at all. South Carolina is one of the highest functioning clemency systems in the United States. Two of the biggest failures, Vermont and Minnesota. And what that means is that there's concentrations of progressive activists in states that have a problem. So let's get to work there while we can. And the fourth thing, and maybe the most important, and this is the takeaway from the experience we had in the last 4 years, and many people in this room worked hard and sacrificed in the effort for clemency. But there was one turning point. Before this turning point, not that much happened, and after, a lot happened. And like so many other things, it's because of Nikichi in large part. But in March of 2016, President Obama went to lunch with people who received clemency. That was the turning point. After that, we saw hundreds. We saw the flow really picked up. And there's a reason for that. And those stories of the people who are out, who are free, to humanize them is really going to be important going forward. And we have an opportunity in that those 1,715 people are out now. And we can tell their stories. We can talk about what they're doing now, how they're reentering, what they're contributing to society. I have this remarkable experience over and over right now, which is that I'm in my office grading papers, and there's a knock on the door, and I look up, and it's somebody, I wrote the story of their life, but I've never met them before. A couple weeks ago, Rudy Martinez knocks on my door. 27 years in prison, and we go out to lunch. And I want to tell you a story. This is going to be quick, okay? But my son's visiting. He's home for the summer. He's a junior at Yale. We go out to lunch, because he was there, me, Rudy, my sons. And my son says, well, what happened, in prison? And Rudy said, I read a book for the first time. And Micah asked him, so what'd you read? And they start talking about books. And they were talking about books I've never read. And Rudy's saying, I never thought Cervantes would be so funny. That's what it's about. That's what we can get to, and that's why we need to tell those stories.
All right, thank you. And just before we move into state issues, I just want to say that Cynthia Roseberry, who was the executive director of Clemency Project 2014, I just want to congratulate her. She's the new executive director of the Council for Court Excellence. So I just wanted to make that an announcement. She's usually a regular here. I want to turn to state issues. Nicole Porter.
Thank you, Nikichi. So the State Issues Working Group is a working group of national organizations that have state priorities. And so far this year, we have met in working group to grapple with around political education given the changing times within the states. In that working group, we've done work to monitor and collaborate on state reforms, including state activity in Nebraska, New Jersey, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and South Dakota. We share information, intelligence, and check in with other groups doing similar work and offer opportunity for collaboration. So just some quick highlights. In Nebraska this year, there's actually a reform to expand the franchise to people with felony convictions. That state has a 2-year waiting ban after the completion of a sentence. And that legislation actually made its way to the governor's desk, although it failed the legislature failed to override the governor's veto. That said, there is a strong coalition. It was the first time that the legislation was introduced, and it was an example of, even in the middle of the country, even in Trump country, these reforms happen. New Jersey has current legislation on Christie's desk that would authorize racial impact statements. Those statements are similar to fiscal or environmental impact statements, but looking at racial disparity for proposed sentencing law in that state also. There has been a robust coalition that's include a range of stakeholders from the faith community to also the civil rights community. So over the last couple of months since the last Justice Roundtable meeting, the working group has workshopped a range of issues that move state reform. In one meeting, we discussed incarceration alternatives for parents who are currently incarcerated who had custody of their children prior to incarceration. And there is ongoing activity in Washington State and Massachusetts this year. And we heard from colleagues at the Justice Strategies who gave us a highlight on that. On the last meeting, we did feature a conversation about jails. So we had colleagues from the Vera Institute for Justice, and we hosted people from DC community who are working on the new jail conversation that is starting to take place in the district. And we also had a brief conversation about the Close Rikers campaign and how that ongoing activity, Close Rikers campaign is an effort in New York City where advocates are working to close the Rikers jail and have a new plan for reimagining the jail system in New York. So we had a robust conversation in the last working group meeting, and it was an opportunity for folks at Vera to engage directly with advocates in the DC area, share information, and share resources and materials, and including they gave a brief update on the report that's been released this week and the briefing later in the week. And we want to continue to have these conversations in the state issues working group meeting. And the next conversation we want to have is look at relief for people with violent offenses in the state level and actually look at reforms that have been adopted. And so our colleagues from the Campaign for Fair Sentencing of Youth, I think, already stepped out. But we want to look at the activity around eliminating juvenile life without parole as a sentencing option within states, scaling that back, and looking at other parole reforms as well. In Washington State this year, legislation was introduced to authorize post-incarceration review for people at 20 who've served at least 20 years in prison, regardless of their underlying offense. So that would impact people sentenced to life in prison and other long-term sentences. We are now meeting the first Wednesday of every month. So the next meeting would be scheduled for July 5th. Although we may reschedule given that that is the week of July 4th. So at the very least, the first Wednesday of every month, unless otherwise notified, and we will send that notice out over the State Issues Working Group listserv. So I invite you to get in contact with me about the working group, or Monica Reed from NACDL, who's here. Monica, please raise your hand. She's also a point of contact, and we encourage you to reach out to us if you have any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Oh, sorry. If anyone wants to say anything more specific about the DC jail situation.
Speak more specific about it if you have. So, yes, okay. So very brief, there has been ongoing conversation around DC building a new jail. There are demands and interests because the current facility is 40 years old, and there's pressure coming from all sides to have a newer, more modern facility. The DC jail population is down significantly, and so there is extra space in the jail. And actually earlier this year, there are two facilities that comprise the DC jail system, one of which was CTF. I always forget what CTF stands for. Okay, so that was owned by DC but managed by private company CCA. And because of a lot of different factors, including support from organizational stakeholders with advocacy groups, the DC government ended the private prison contract and transferred control of that part of the jail back to DC government. That has led to an ongoing conversation, contributed to an ongoing conversation about what to do with the space to detain people in the jail system, including this conversation that's been going on for several years now around building a new facility.
So can we just say that there's a group that's looking at those issues? So just
Sure,
so
we can say that. Nikki.
Yeah, okay.
You didn't say that before. We said that.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Nikichi.
Good, thank you. I want to move right to youth justice.
Hi, this is Jenny Collier again. Thanks, Nkichi. And I'm going to do this really quickly with my colleague Marcy, who co-chairs the National Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Coalition and the Act for JJ Coalition, which is really where most of this work is housed. And we report out to the Justice Roundtable about it. But number one, it sounds like we're going to have potentially a House Judiciary Committee hearing probably at the crime subcommittee level, but it's unclear right now. It's not been noticed yet. That will focus on juvenile justice issues and will include probably some of the issues that the committee was dealing with last year, including solitary confinement, perhaps juvenile life without parole, unclear whether the expungement pieces will be included. And so we're learning more about that process. It sounds like the hearing might be on Thursday, June 22nd. And then I want to turn it over to Marcy, who has headed an amazing advocacy effort on the JDDPA Reauthorization Act and has made incredible progress again early this Congress after last Congress. So go ahead, Marcy. Thanks.
Ooh, thanks, Jenny. And we certainly open that door to everyone at this table who hasn't already contributed time and resources. But JJDPA has been updated significantly and passed already through the House on voice vote back in April. It then was introduced simultaneously in the Senate and has still being stuck now for 16 months by Senator Tom Cotton, who opposes one part of the bill. Mr. Grassley moved to strike that part of the bill, and Rand Paul objected to that. So we've got a Rand Paul, Tom Cotton argument going on in the Senate. We are trying to shake that loose because we feel like this is something that should be won and won easily. The Senate bill number is 860 if anyone wants to look at it. We are open to either 860 passing or for them to take up the House and pass. We are open to the VCO getting struck at this point to unshake that and move it through a different vehicle. We are asking people to please call the co-sponsors, especially the Republican co-sponsors, and let them make it known to both Grassley and McConnell this is a priority for them. And we've leveraged Kentucky. We're partnering with the ACLU, who's doing patch-through calls this week to let the Mr. McConnell's office know that this is a priority for his constituents. But really, anything you guys can do to add to the noise to make this should be an easy lift, in my opinion. It was preserved in the president's budget in terms of the formula grants, which also means that he might actually sign the bill if it gets to his desk. One other thing is the Sentencing Commission did put out a report on youthful offenders. If you guys haven't seen that, it's actually a really strong report. It looks at young people under the age of 25, which is an interesting nod, I think, to brain science. And it's got really good data in it. So they'll decide whether that's a priority or not, but it's a good report to get out to the field.
Okay, thank you so very much. I am going to combine human rights and racial justice with this announcement. Well, first, one announcement is I always want to remind everyone that we're going into the third year of the International Decade of People of African Descent. That's a United Nations declared decade of which we have not heard too much buzz in this country about, which I hope will be changing in the very near future. So keep, stay woke and stay tuned with respect to that. You said right. Okay. I want to also say that today, on June 13th, with support from Google, the Equal Justice Initiative, the organization that Brian Stevenson heads, launched a project that brings an often overlooked history and the personal stories behind it online. And it's a history dealing with that whole a concept from slavery, from enslavement to mass incarceration. And he is launching with 3 videos. One is, I don't think slavery ended in 1865. And there's a whole suggested talking points for Facebook and Instagram on that. The next one is, the racial terror has been embedded into you generation after generation. And then the third video is, they took off the white robe and put on the black robe. So stay tuned for this. We'll have all of this on the Justice Roundtable website, justiceroundtable.org, the Justice Roundtable Twitter account, Twitter @Justice Roundtab, Round Tab or Tabe or whatever, and hashtag Justice Roundtable. I haven't quite gotten to Instagram yet, so we don't have that. Our roundtable is coming to a close. We're about to do announcements. I'm going to give one major announcement, and actually, I really would like to close with my one announcement, but folks have announcements they want to give. But before I give the announcement, I just really want to thank all of the working groups and people who are part of the roundtable. It's the working groups that really came together and produced this very, very comprehensive document. It's the working groups, again, that's the lifeblood of the Justice Roundtable. And you see the names that were up on the screen and the contact information. So I hope that you show that as well. Really, really want to thank James Foreman Jr. for coming out and sharing his phenomenal new book, Locking Up Our Own Crime and Punishment. Yeah, in Black America. I want to thank Forward TV for live streaming this, and I already thank Jasmine Mickens, my senior policy associate. But I also want to thank my new research assistant intern, Carmen Crusoe, who's a second-year student at Howard University. So my announcement is, immediately following this, anyone interested in the working group of the drug policy working group, they're going to be meeting right after this in one of the conference rooms. See Michael Collins if you have questions. But later on today at 6 o'clock p.m., the Justice Roundtable is thrilled to co-host a reception with formerly incarcerated phenomenal woman, Susan Burton, who just wrote a book. She spent years in and out of prisons. She's based on the West Coast. She came out and started phenomenal reentry programs for women. Her new book just came out, Becoming Miss Burton. So she'll be here. McKinney and Associates will be co-hosting this, and they will be launching their new venture that's called Just Us Voices, that's going to be talking about the voices of the formerly incarcerated, the whole constituency really that we are really working in support of. So again, I want to thank everyone for coming out to this roundtable. I want to go in and officially close it off right now. I know that we've been live streaming and we needed to keep to our deadline, which is 12 o'clock. So unless you have something pressing, which it seems like Jumana does.
It's a fast announcement. State Criminal Justice Network Conference is coming up, moving forward, forging on effective and creative state criminal justice reforms. It's in San Francisco on the 27th and 28th of July. You can find it on our website, necdl.org. How's that?
Thanks for mentioning that. I plan to be there. Okay, again, thank you so very much, Justice Roundtable. James Foreman will be signing books. Do it here or in the alcove, right in the alcove right there to the side. There's more breakfast. Eat up.